We thank Dr. James Keach for hanging in there. I called him early and he was waiting for us. So Dr. Keach's topic tonight is the Goldilocks zone, a review of intermediate orchids and how to grow them. But Dr. Keach has a very interesting background. Did you know that although he got his bachelor's at Hampshire College, a master's at Washington State, and a PhD at Cornell, he's now the assistant professor and assistant extension agent for ornamentals and master gardeners. And his unit is the Department of Tropical Plant and Soil Sciences. And he works in Kauai at the Kauai Extension Office. And he's part of CTAR, which is acronym for College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources. We're very proud to have him with us because, he started from grassroots. Did you know that he was, he even worked at Frankie's Nursery in Waimanalo? And even in Singapore, he has many publications and went to the World Orchid Conference. And he also speaks several languages, including Spanish, English, of course, and Thai. And so we're really proud and interested to hear his talk tonight because it's kind of a combination of some of his publications. So without further ado, and thank you for waiting, Dr. Keach. Here is Dr. Keach to speak on the Goldilocks zone.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I wanted to really thank the whole Orchid Society for inviting me. As Kathy said, I had lived on Oahu back in 2005, 2006, and I have great memories of going to the orchid show at the Blaisdell and seeing all the different plants there, the different displays. So I feel really, really honored to be able to come back and be able to talk with you all. I'm gonna start my screen sharing and hopefully no Murphy's Law. Does that look all right to everyone?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, just move Zoom stuff out of the way so I can see. And all right. So as Kathy said, I wanted to talk a little bit today about the intermediate orchids and kind of go over some and then also some tips about growing them. And one thing, I'm going to focus mostly on species because when we're classifying orchids as cool growing or hot growing or intermediate, we're typically talking about the species, not about the hybrids made with them, because it, as different things gets into the pedigree, it kind of changes how a plant is able to grow. And a good example of this is a plant I saw in Singapore when I was working there called Cattleya red doll. And this is a cross of Psyche, which is Cattleya coccinea crossed with Cattleya cinnabarina, and then Psyche back crossed to Cattleya coccinea. Cattleya coccinea, if anyone's tried to grow it, is a really difficult plant to grow. It's really cool growing. It's very picky about its roots. And the idea of trying to flower it in Singapore, which is 1 degree north of the equator, average temperatures in the mid 80s, people thought there was no way that anything with any amount of coccinea in the background would be able to flower. But right before I moved back from Singapore to Hilo, I was talking to a friend and he had pictures and could prove that sure enough, even something with that much of a cool growing species in its ancestry could still bloom in hot, humid, tropical Singapore. So as I said, I'm going to focus mostly on species, but I am going to get a little bit into hybrids towards the end and some of the implications that has for, if there's a species you really like and you see that's really cool growing or really hot growing, don't despair. Maybe look for a hybrid that combines some of those characteristics. All right, so just as a quick overview of how I'm going to talk about things, I spent some time trying to figure out what the term intermediate means. It's something I hear a lot in the orchid world, but it's not something that I immediately found a good definition for. I'll talk a little bit about cheating. If you have some conditions that you want to grow plants and you don't think it's quite appropriate for that, some ways you can sometimes get around your conditions. I'll go through several examples of different intermediate classified orchids for different groups. I'm obviously not going to be able to go through all of them. I will show you at the end how to get every orchid in Orchid Whiz classified that way if you're really interested. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the extreme outliers that kind of challenge our perceptions. I know in the blurb that got sent around, I talked about Vanda and Cattleya relatives that can tolerate light frosts and Masdevallias that can flower near the equator. So I'm not just blowing smoke with that, I'm going to actually talk to you about those a little bit. Then I'll get into some less common intermediate orchids that aren't in kind of some of the groups we're more familiar with. As I mentioned, I'll talk about hybrids and how they can expand things and give you some information on resources. Oh, and I forgot to mention on the previous slide, I'm also doing some consulting work for Kalapana Tropicals. Say that as full disclosure, this is separate from my job here at the university. But when I told them I would be giving this talk, they said, I asked, hey, would it be possible to get a discount for the members of the Honolulu Orchid Society? So I know I can't be there in person to bring plants to sell, which I know is always really fun at the meetings. But this way, if you are interested, I'll give you some information on the last slide about a discount. All right, so getting into the brass tacks of what intermediate means. On the left-hand side here, I have all these different quotes. I was going through orchid books from back from the 50s till up to the mid-2000s. And these were some of the different things I saw. Night temperatures, talking about day temperatures, talking about elevation, talking about winter versus summer. When I went through, I took all of these, I sort of averaged them out, and what it basically came down to was lows of 55 to 62 and highs just around 80. And if we look at this map of Hawaii's different hardiness zones, that's a really good chunk of the state. Maybe some of the higher elevations, it's a little cool. There might be a few areas, especially leeward sides where it might be a little hot at some times of the year, but we can grow a wide range of orchids. I think it's one of many things that's wonderful about this state. And most of the orchids I talked about today can be grown throughout the state here. I should also say most, but not all of the orchids that I'll talk about, I've at least attempted growing before and had some decent success with. And the pictures, unless they say otherwise, are mine, either from my collection or from places I've worked at. So getting into modifying your growing area, I just talked about intermediate, talk a little bit about cooler, hot. And one thing I always hear when people talk about temperatures is, oh, but these are my conditions, what can I do? And these are some things that I've heard about over the years as suggestions for ways to modify it. Vertical space is something I see a lot of orchid folks not really taking advantage of, especially if you're in a dense kind of urban area. We tend to kind of think, okay, most of this growing area is about the same, but really as you put things higher, especially if it's open at top, there's an appreciable difference in temperature. This photo is from when I was working in Singapore. There we have air-conditioned greenhouses because it's so close to the equator. That's how they grow some of the cooler growing things. And so we would play around with the different heights to grow a wider range of species. Water temperature is another way that you can modify the conditions for a plant. I always say be cautious with this, because you can really boil a plant if you take super hot water, and you can shock a plant with really cold water, although sometimes it works out well. I'm not sure how many of you knew Jeannie Nue, but I remember she brought in a beautiful plant of Cattleya, or what used to be Sophronis coccinea, one time in bloom, and everyone was asking her, how do you bloom this? And what she said, at least as I remember, is that she got up at midnight every night and would take a glass of ice water and pour it on the plant. I'm not saying you have to get that extreme, but there are some species of orchids that even if the top of them gets really hot, if the roots stay cool, like Adisas, they can still keep growing. So something you might be able to play around with. Air circulation is another thing. It's a good way of cooling things down if your conditions are a little hot. It's also a great way to help prevent diseases. A lot of diseases like things to the air to stay kind of stagnant. So we always recommend it when I'm talking with commercial growers. And then shade, of course, is one way to do it. I think we hear a lot about shade cloth, but also other plants, orchids or companion plants or other things. And then I was looking for an excuse to throw this photo in. I saw it on Facebook and just had to kind of put it in there, but I will say it's true. The substrate and the colors of that can really affect the growing area of the plant. And so if you do have an area that's a little cooler, try something that's dark, and so it'll absorb more of the light and heat. Same thing if you're in an area that's really kind of hot and you're trying to keep things cool, go for kind of lighter colors. And they sell different white films that you can put over pots. I've seen people use shredded paper as a topping to their pots sometimes. Play around with it a little bit, but you can definitely modify your conditions. When I was on the mainland, they called this zone denial. You don't want to believe you're in a certain zone, so you do some things to make it a little bit different. So as I mentioned, I'm going to get into a few types of orchids from some of the major groups that are intermediate, and I'm especially focusing on ones that I don't see grown as much, or that I think people might not be as aware of. I will get into a few outliers, and then I'll get into some really funky stuff towards the end. So getting into oncidiums, I think when we think oncidiums, we think of kind of the spacillatum, like dancing lady types. And we're seeing more and more of these kind of ornithorhynchum types up here, kind of like Twinkle or Siku Marguerite. But as a species, ornithorhynchum is really nice and intermediate. It had a reputation for a while as being cool growing, but it does pretty well, even at kind of intermediate to slightly warm temperatures. And so, I'd say of the plants here, ornithorhynchum and then Miltonia morelliana are probably two of the more common. Miltonia morelliana is amazing to me. I've seen it grown really cool. I've seen it grown in full sun in, the hot tropics, really widely adaptable. Both of these have incredible fragrances. Ornithorhynchum, or a close relative of it, is the source of fragrance for the chocolate orchids. So really worth adding to your collection if you want something that's really rewarding and as a species. Other kind of things that are a little bit less common is we start to get into things like Trichocentrum. These are great orchids, and I was trying to find a good photo in my backup of all the leaves. They have really beautiful kind of mottled leaves that are green with sort of orange sort of patterning, so it looks almost like a shade on a forest floor. But these really nice flowers, and these look like normal oncidium shape, but they're quite a bit bigger. I'm trying to think, what is that, about 2 inches tall? The plants are a lot more tolerant, I think, than oncidiums of some of the wider range of conditions, and just really, really great in terms of reblooming. Getting into things that are a little bit kind of shadier, Trichopelia suavis is one. All of the Trichopelias are classified as intermediates. These are really nice in that they have these rather large flowers for an oncidium. These are about the size of, I'd say, like a Cattleya most of the time. And the different species have different fragrances. Suavis, we were trying to classify the fragrance. I think it's almost like baby powder. It's what we decided as kind of a one. And then one that I really don't see in circulation as much, but I think is really stunning, is Oncidium, or it used to be Mexicoa gisbretiana. And these are really great species. We used to grow these in kind of the cooler conditions, but we've also grown them outside when I was in Singapore. And there's also hybrids between this and Brassia that get some of the patterning. But it's just a really cheerful species. It's a relatively floriferous, really worth adding to your collection. Oh, and of course, Psychopsis Mendenhall. And this is a hybrid. It's a cross between two different Psychopsis species. But if you haven't seen a Psychopsis before, they are also huge for an oncidium. Psychopsis is from butterfly, and Papilio also, Papilio is from butterfly. Really great flowers. They dance. They're at really tall spikes, and they're just really arresting, and can grow in full sun or can grow in the shade like this. So definitely worthwhile to check out. So I mentioned, I think in the blurb that got sent out, about heat-tolerant cymbidiums. And boy, this could be a whole talk within itself. Thailand, there's a ton of work by Kobsuk Karanan and of Pakrat orchids. And he's been trying to breed cymbidiums that can really take high heat. You know, being Bangkok, it's pretty warm, you know, that's the idea there. But I think, you know, traditionally a lot of folks think of cymbidiums as being pretty cool growing. I know a lot of the cymbidiums, when I grew them on the mainland, they would say, you know, take them out after the last frost and bring them in just before the first one. So a pretty wide range of temperatures. And, you know, people kind of get that idea stuck in their head, but there's some really wonderful warm growing cymbidiums. This is a list on the left, ones I didn't have pictures of, but I think it's worth describing. Dayanum is one that actually is considered a weed within the state. And if you go to Volcano National Park, if you go into kind of the Hamakua coast on Big Island, you'll see this growing on the side of the road, which is where I took this picture. There's also two pendulous species from Singapore in that area, Aloifolium and then Finlaysonianum, which look really similar to me. I'm not a taxonomist, so I'm not going to try to differentiate them. They have kind of hard leaves, more like almost a vanda than a normal cymbidium. And I have seen these for sale around the state. I saw some at the Hilo Orchid Show last year. And then encepholium is one that I think is really interesting. It's a pretty easy to grow species. It has incredible fragrance. It's not a huge plant. Flowers are smaller than other cymbidiums, but it has kind of a like dedicated following. I'll talk in a slide or two about Neophoenicia or Vanda falcata, but in China, there's a similar culture to that for Cymbidium encepholium, where people grow all these different flower forms. So, you know, we see greens, we see pinks. This is kind of more of a standard. You see peloric ones where the lips are replacing the petals. You also see ones where they just grow it for different colorations of the foliage. Really, really rewarding. If you've ever grown or seen Cymbidium golden elf, it's one that, you know, is bright gold, kind of smaller flowers than a normal Cymbidium. It has encepholium as one of its parents, and it's another really great heat-tolerant Cymbidium species. Masdevallias, Draculas, some other pleurothalids. I think these really get it classified a lot as these have to be super cold growing. You need, you know, to be basically at the volcano or have really specialized like air conditioning. But there are several relatively warm growing species. I wouldn't put these out in full sun, you know, at the equator, but I think with a little bit of adaptation, you could grow most of these around here. And actually, when I was in Singapore, someone managed to flower Dryadella edwallii outdoors there. And again, you know, Singapore is mid 80s. You know, I think the lows in the whole year are in the mid 70s. So pretty hot temperatures. I haven't seen that one as much here, but I have seen Dracula inequalis, one of the monkey orchids. Several of the other Draculas do really well. I don't see these around as much, but Chestertonii, I think, is great among the Draculas because it has this huge lip. And they said it's supposed to be a mushroom mimic. And that's why the lip is kind of that shape. It has kind of a mushroomy smell. Dracula soderoi is another one to check out if you're looking for one. I know one of the things that people talk about with the Draculas is they're normally pendulous, they're going down from the plant. Soderoi is one of the few Dracula species where the spikes go up and then curve back down. So you don't need a slotted basket to grow them in. Some of the other Masdevallias, there's a few that are considered, if not heat loving, then at least heat tolerant. Discoidea is one. There's a few relatives of that as well. Midgiana is considered really heat tolerant. I've only grown it a little bit, so I don't have as much experience. But pozoi and some of the other related species where they have these great sprays of flowers also do well. Herudere is one that I've seen for sale around here. It's also nice in that it's a fragrant Masdevallia and just gets covered with flowers like this at about the end of the year. Really easy to grow and reflower. I neglected mine because I forgot it under something else that was in the greenhouse and came back and it was in full flower. So it, you know, is still pretty tolerant. And then poroglossums are Masdevallia and Dracula relatives that we don't see as often, but I think really deserve some attention. They are cross-compatible. You can make hybrids with Masdevallias, but the neat thing about them, I can't find my video of it, is the lip kind of floats almost like a bulbophyllum, but then if something lands on it, it acts like a spring and snaps and sticks the insect into the flower there. And then after, I think it's about 30 minutes, the lip will slowly release, but it essentially is supposed to stun the insect and then force it to kind of take the pollen on its back. So Rotary Goya is one that I think is relatively easy to grow for a poriclossum. There's a lot of different color forms of it. I'd love to see more of these getting into circulation. So getting into some of the extremes, I mentioned about Vandas and then Cattleya relatives that can take light frosts. The one on the left is one you might be familiar with. It's now Vanda, but used to be Neophonetia falcata, or the samurai orchid. Native to temperate Japan. There's, as I was sort of alluding to with Cymbidium mensifolium, there are whole societies in Japan that grow nothing but Vanda falcata, different color forms, different leaf forms, like you can see the variegation here. And I had always thought, oh, it's not really that cold tolerant. But when I was in Tokyo, I accidentally stumbled across a temple, and there were ones growing on trees there that seemed, several years old, quite happy. And I was talking with a researcher on the mainland, Hideki Kobayashi, who was doing some research and trying to breed cold tolerance into plants. He said he accidentally had a great trial of this a few years ago when the heating failed in his greenhouse, and he's in Kentucky. And he said almost all of his Vanda relatives, even the other ones that are supposed to be cold tolerant, died. Said the Vanda falcata didn't like being frozen, but it did survive and keep blooming. And this is when, if you're in a really cool area, sometimes heating it up a little bit can force it to flower. It makes great hybrids. It tends to be really dominant, but I've seen some really neat things coming out. If you cross it with Papilionanthe terres, which is one of the parents of the Vanda or Papilionanthe miswokim or joachim, depending on who you ask if you're in Singapore or here, you get these really nice flowers like this, and it keeps some of the kind of like pencil foliage like the terres, but smaller stature from the falcata. Also does really great things if you breed it with larger plants like Arides odorata. You get a different range of color forms this way. It has its own fragrance, then you combine it with other ones, they keep a fragrance as well. This is one I saw, I forget, I think is selling in either Home Depot in Hilo or at like one of the consignment garden stores there. Just been really surprised some of the stuff that's just floating around. The one on the right is one that I don't see as much in circulation, but I've grown before and I'd love to see more people working with it. It's a Epidendrum conopsium. This one is native to the southeastern US, all the way from Florida to North Carolina, can take light frosts, and it's also super miniature compared to most of the epidendrums. So I think, epidendrums, I think at least a foot tall or so. This one is maybe 2 or 3 inches tall, and it breeds that into other plants. I've seen this hybrid floating around, a cross between it and Brassavola nodosa, green dragon, very tiny plants as well, very prolific flowerer. I have one that unfortunately the moss outgrew it, and so I've been trying to coax it back into happiness, but I saw this for sale in Hilo recently. There's a lot of hybrids that were made with it, based from Jim Rumrill. He did a lot of these crosses in the 70s. I don't think he made this one, but he did use it later. This was one that actually was in UH Manoa's greenhouses for a while, a cross between Canopsium and Aurantiaca, where you're getting a different color form. And I should also say Canopsium is fragrant at night, just like Brassavola nodosa is. It has a really sort of unusual, sweet, spicy fragrance that's really great. So definitely something to look out for. And if you're in an area that's really cool, you're convinced you can't grow any orchids, I'm telling you, these ones will hold up pretty well. Getting into other sort of vandaceous ones that can tolerate kind of more intermediate conditions. Again, we think of vandas often as being really, really hot growing. These are ones that I've seen in pretty decently cool to intermediate and everything in between. Rhynchostylus gigantea is probably one of the better known ones here. This one was interesting to me because I've seen it grown in really cool regions of Thailand, but it would also flower well in Singapore. One thing we did see is that the hotter conditions, you tend to get shorter flower spikes. And so just being aware of that, if you're looking for like kind of these were at an orchid show in Thailand, so your results may vary. But Thailand's also been great. It's native to there, and they're releasing new color forms all the time. They have this great orange one. There's a solid pink one. There's a brown one that I guess some people really like, a green one, lots and lots of color forms. I've seen a few of them floating around here. Hocoglossum wangii is one that is also starting to kind of get into circulation. This is one I actually picked up again when I was in Hilo recently. Great Vanda-like plant, has kind of those semi-terete leaves that are a little thinner, so can tolerate a little bit higher light, but also does well. I've seen it in pretty cool conditions. Rhobaceteas, there's several species of these, and they all have these kind of great, like almost cluster of grape type drupes of flowers. Really small, but really rewarding. And the plants flower when they're relatively small, just a few inches tall. Different color forms depending on the species. There were, I forget who was selling them, but someone was selling these at the Hilo Orchid Show last year. Luisia species are other ones that are worth checking out. They have that thin kind of pencil-like foliage, kind of like the Papilionanthes, but can also grow in pretty decent shade. And they tend to have green flowers with a contrasting lip. And I've seen people breed them with other things to kind of get a wider range of conditions. Tuberolabiums are also ones that I've seen in really cool all the way to really hot. This is one in Singapore that was grown just in water with added nutrients. There's like a big craze there for water culture orchids. I think it's catching on here in some places, that did really well in a range of conditions. Clasocentron is one that I know is hitting the kind of popularity markets because of the color. People think it's the closest to kind of a true blue that we're really seeing in Vandas. Another with kind of this terete pointy foliage. Rhinanthera citrina is one that I like. All of the Rhinanthus I think are a little tolerant, but citrina is cooler growing than some of the really hot tropical larger ones. And this one flowers when it's less than a foot tall. I, again, was neglecting mine. This isn't a photo of it. This is another one. But I came back and, it had been stuck in a corner. It was in full flower. Like most Rhinantheras, the flowers don't last really long, but they're really, really striking. Vanda vietnamica is another one that's really tolerant, super hot to pretty cool. Ceratocentron phacelia is, if you're really into miniatures, this is a great species to grow. It grows pretty well, and there's also hybrids between it and Tuberolabium cotoense. Also, what used to be Ascocentrum, many species within there tend to be pretty tolerant. I've seen them grown in pretty decent shade. I've seen them grown in full sun. They flower multiple times a year. Flowers aren't super long-lived, but they're bright. All of them are brightly colored. And then the last one on here, this is almost opening a can of worms. So Chylocista lunifera is one of those leafless orchids. And these are really starting to catch on in some areas. When I was in Singapore, they'd started importing them from Indonesia and from Thailand. There's a range of different colors, different species within this genus and some of the other ones, but really rewarding. And they're small plants too, just like a few inches across and tall. But, if you want a bit of a challenge, an orchid without leaves can be a pretty fun one. Getting into Cattleyas, some of the other ones that are a little bit more intermediate growing. Forbesii is one that I think is really underutilized. It's a short plant, it flowers throughout the year. It only puts out one flower per pseudobulb, but they're really nice, kind of relatively long lasting, and have a decent fragrance. I know one place on Big Island has gotten the semi-alba form of this, I think, or the aurea form, which is like neon chartreuse green. Cattleya clandii is also one worth checking out. We grew this in our ultra cool house in Singapore. I've also seen it flower at lowland Singapore in full sun. A little happier, if it's slightly cooler than Singapore, but I think we're well within that zone. Short plant, several flowers per inflorescence, and again, a great fragrance, plus that wonderful contrast. Guarianthia rantiaca is one that's used quite a bit in breeding to up the flower count. If you like color forms, there's white, yellow, red, the whole shebang. This is one called Mishima Spots that was released recently, semi-recently, I guess, and is pretty nice in that it's, easy to grow and flower. Lalias, I could get into them at length. These are mostly the Mexican species of Lalia. This is Leontii that has this great patterning, and it plus Persithecea cochleata are some of the few Cattleyas that are non-resupinate. So instead of being kind of this upright form like we're used to, they go upside down. And Persicea cochleata, they actually call it the cuttlefish orchid because they say with this and then these petals
Mm.
and sepals, it looks like cuttlefish drying, especially in areas like Taiwan. Very easy to grow. The plant looks a lot like an Oncidium to me, but you probably have seen around radiata, which is another close relative of it, and that flowers really well seasonally here. Leptodes, I haven't seen unicolor locally, but I've seen bicolor, which is white petals and a kind of pinkish lip. Another really nice terete leafed one. So again, when we see these kind of like pine needle-like leaves, it normally means the plant can tolerate higher temperatures to some extent because it has less surface area to lose liquid through. So not always 100% a trait to look for, but definitely something, if you see might be worth testing out. You'll see that in some forms of Brassavola nodosa, some of the other Brassavolas like cucullata, where they also have foliage like that or some variation. And then one I rarely see here, but I really would love to see more people growing is Calarthron, or it used to be Diacrium bicornutum. This one they call the dove orchid because they say it looks like a little dove there. It's a sequential flower, so it stays in bloom for many months. It's fragrant. It grows like a weed, and all of its hybrids grow like weeds. I was talking with a breeder about it last weekend, and he said the only problem is almost everything you breed with it turns out white or pink. So there's not a lot of color variation in the hybrids, but it's really easy to grow. And I have seen several hybrids of it for sale around here. I think Ethel's Paradise is one. I bought a plant that was marked off 75% at the Hilo Home Depot, looked very kind of dried out and dead, of Ethel's Paradise. Stuck it on a plumeria tree, forgot about it, came back several months later and it covered half the branch. So, it really seems to impart that vigor. Encyclias, there's a wide range of encyclias that grow really well in kind of intermediate conditions. I think, again, some of them we have ideas of being maybe a little pickier, but there's actually Encyclia tampensis, named for Tampa, Florida, because it can grow all the way up into that coolant environment. This is patens. This was one I saw last weekend at Calipana Tropicals when I was there. There's a lot of interest in breeding with this type and hoping to try to get this kind of branching inflorescence into a cattleya. I haven't seen too much done with this. And then kind of rounding out the cattleyas, the standard used in a lot of breeding, Rhyncholalia digbyana. This is one that, again, I think people tend to think of as hot growing, tends to like full sun. There's reports of it growing on a cactus in some areas, are pretty tolerant of dry conditions, but does relatively well in somewhat cool ones too. I've been pleasantly surprised. It and its less showy sibling, Rhyncholalia glauca. Another encyclia, like I mentioned, this one's alata. And then one that I haven't seen here, but again, I think it's really worthwhile to grow. Domingoa used to be Nagiliella purpurea. This one is nice because it has, again, kind of attractive foliage and really long inflorescences with these super tiny flowers, but they'll keep flowering repeatedly, even, if you mistreat it and all the flowers die off, they say never cut them back because the flowers will start back up in another year or two when it recovers. And there's a few small hybrids that have been made with this too, but definitely one worth checking out. Again, get to enjoy the leaves even if the flowers aren't there. Dendrobiums, oh my gosh, dendrobiums and slippers. I started to put them together and thought this will be a whole presentation if I put them all here. So I'm just going over a few kind of standout ones that I think are really easy to grow. Lady slippers, Path concolor is probably one of the wider ranged ones, I think. Does really well in heat. I've seen it, again, in lowland Singapore. I've also seen it way up in Chiang Mai in relatively cool conditions. Flowers easily. There's a few closely related ones, some that are more round, some that have this really nice stripe, some that are more spotted, but pretty good range of them. In Thailand, they have whole exhibits of nothing but this species sometimes. So it's really kind of one that you can get into and find some great variation. Henryanum is one that I don't know why, but seems to be rare in cultivation. I managed to keep it alive in a greenhouse in Massachusetts for several years and did pretty well. Has that really nice kind of bubblegum pink pouch that I think is, a really nice standout if you want something that's a little shocking. Bessier is also really brightly colored. This is a Phragmipedium, and I will say Bessier can be a little more challenging than some of the other slippers here. but hybrids with it are really easy to grow. And there's actually another frag that I hadn't grown, so I didn't want to put it up here, frag Andrettii, which is considered hot growing. It's the only frag that I know of that does that. But these are great species to grow, and the hybrids are really, really easy. There are also ones that you can leave them sitting in water. A lot of the growers I knew in Singapore did that, and they'll still do well, even if it's in a kind of soggy media like sphagnum. And then Path spicerianum, this is another one that did well all over Singapore and Thailand, from cool areas to large areas. I stumbled across one of these in a guy's backyard in Hilo, and he said, oh yeah, came with the house in a pod. I don't think I've ever repotted it. Plant was probably 2 feet wide, and just covered with blooms. It's one that really can do well under kind of a range of conditions. I know I'm getting a little tight on time. Try to kind of wrap this up in the next few slides. Dendrobiums, I'll say there's a few different sections that do well, but pretty much any of the ones you try, maybe the nobile types like it a little bit cooler, and the Cuthbertsonii, kind of those super tiny ones, but a lot of the other groups do well. Lautorias, famous from Oahu H&R orchids, I know really popularized these, but also some of the ones used in kind of traditional moth type Dendrobium phalaenopsis breeding. Athene is one I don't see around as much. This was a clone that was multiplied and cloned a lot in Singapore, but they said you had to be careful because it would flower itself to death, just putting out spike after spike. Really nice, easy to grow though. Cruminatum's one I've seen around here. The pigeon orchid, flowers only last 1 day, but they're fragrant and definitely forms a weed. Polysema is another kind of Lautoria type. And then Officinalia is one I wanted to mention because I've just seen a few plants of it here, but it's actually used in traditional Chinese medicine. And it's related to the Hono Hono types. Different flower color, obviously, smaller plants than a Hono Hono. But if you're looking for something, you can grow a Hono Hono, you can probably grow this pretty well. Okay, so getting into less common things, I'll send the slides out. I'm not going to go through every name, but just to highlight some groups that tend to do pretty well. So we see, say, the ones over here on the left tend to be a little cooler. The ones on the right, I think, are a little warmer, but still all intermediate. Angricoids, these are ones that look like vandas, but tend to be white, mostly native to Africa. Encelia now is Agonesia cyanea. This is a zygopetalum relative that has these great kind of bluish flowers, can grow, again, in hot tropics all the way up to kind of cool highlands, and anything that's bred with it is easy to grow and flower that way. Collagenes, dendrochilums are ones that I think if you want a good self-esteem orchid, dendrochilums are nice in that they flower a lot, they form specimen plants that are really huge well, and there's several different species and colors that you can get going. Habanerias are kind of more terrestrial types. They're deciduous, they drop their leaves, but they come in some neon colors, and I've seen a few of these in Hilo just being offered. Maxillaria, I'll get to in another slide. I mentioned Miltonia. Miltoniopsis, a little bit cooler, I would say, than true intermediates, but I've seen people even growing some of the pure species in relatively hot conditions. Sobralias, I'm seeing these take off as landscape plants. Stanhopias, again, with kind of these great fragrant pendulous flowers. Vanilla, I think, is really common here as just kind of a yard plant, but there's also ornamental forms. And then zygopetalums are neon green. I can't believe I didn't put a photo up here with a contrasting purple lip, sort of like this. But definitely all different ones to look out for. Bulbophyllums, again, a great one where I think there's already some of these available locally, but these are ones that I wanted to highlight as being particularly easy to grow, I think, in many cases. Lobii, I've seen people in pretty much every set of conditions grow lobii, and it flowers on, near constantly throughout the year. You can mount it. I've seen it grown in pots. I don't think it has a great fragrance like most bulbophyllums, as I was told once. They don't have a fragrance, they have a scent or a stink. This is one of those like really stinky ones. Echinolabium's another one. These are huge flowers. Smells like a dead rat, but great color. And there's some hybrids coming out with it too that are smaller and possibly better scented. Again, variegated ones are really nice to look into just if you want something that's rewarding even when it's not in flower. And then Fascinator is one that I think has been around for ages. It's considered one that's, a relatively good beginner orchid. We tend to see the purple form, but there are semi-albas like this that are starting to hit the markets. And then Oratum, some of these kind of daisy bulbophyllums, as people call them, are really nice to grow. Bulbophyllums are good in that most of them are relatively small plants too. So if you're in a constrained urban area, these might be ones to check out. And I should say they have a reputation for all smelling bad, but I've heard there are some species that smell nice, like lemons. I've never actually smelled one, so I remain to be convinced, but worth looking out for. Maxillaria, getting to the end here, I think we think of mostly Tenuifolia, the coconut orchid, really strong smell like coconuts, but it's a huge genus with all these different color forms, different sizes. Tenuifolia is maybe an inch by an inch, very easy and rewarding orchid to grow. I gave one once to a friend, and they showed it to me kind of proudly, and they'd repotted it in soil, and it had been in pure soil for 6 months, I think, at that point, still growing and flowering. Larger ones, striatas, several inches wide. There's some great different colors, different sizes. Schunkiana is one that's really kind of getting popular because it's I don't know that it's a true black, but it's blackish orchid. And, I think they always have that kind of romance. Very small, but very floriferous. And so then, I sort of mentioned at the beginning about how don't despair if there's a species that's considered really hard to grow under your conditions. This was a hybrid that was made by one of the breeders when I was in Singapore. He crossed Victoria reginate, which is a absolutely cool growing plant, highlands of the Philippines, super high elevations. The flowers are relatively long-lived and have this amazing color. He crossed it with Dendrobium cruminatum, the pigeon orchid. These are lowland, really hot, can take up to the mid-90s without a problem, but the flowers only last a day. And the head of the garden at that time, Dr. Tan, had wanted different colors of the pigeon orchid. And he managed to get ones that came out in this range of colors that could grow in lowland Singapore or in highlands, like in the Philippines. And the flowers only last 5 days, but that's still better than one. When I left, they were making more hybrids with this and had a whole range of other colors coming out. Another just example of a hybrid, even if they're both kind of cool growing or difficult to grow, these are, I think, two of the harder Cattleya species to grow, Coccinia and Bregeri. But you cross them together to make Polestar. Polestar, I won't say it's an easy orchid to grow, but it's way easier to grow than either Coccinia or Bregeri. So if there's a species you see and you really fall in love with, maybe see if there are hybrids, even if it's with something else that has a reputation for being difficult. Plants here at the bottom are all from Ben Oliveros over on Big Island. Resources, if you want to find out about what kind of conditions different plants want, these are 3 kind of resources I use quite a bit. Orchid Roots is a free pedigree database, but for species, if you go to the summary tab, it normally puts you at the photos first. The summary, and you click on distribution, you can see where a species is native to, like Maxillaria coccinea here. And then you can look up conditions there. Orchidspecies.com has kind of a 90s feel to the website, but they have really great icons next to all the names. They use a confusing naming system. So I would say, just be willing to search for synonyms, but Orchid Roots is really good at finding synonyms for names too, if you can't find them at first glance. And then the orchid species culture sheets are amazing. They're really detailed. There's only a few of them that are offered free, but if you have Orchid Whiz, or you know someone who has Orchid Whiz, all of the culture sheets are available through that. It used to be a pretty pricey program. It was $300, I think, at the beginning for the program, and then $150 or $100 a year for the updates. They're unfortunately talking about going out of business, but that means they are marking it down. They're just not going to be updating it. But if you want super in-depth information, Orchid Whiz is a really great program to use. I think it only works on PCs though. But if you do have it, you want to find out about growing conditions, or you want a list of hot growing pleurothalids, you could go into list species, pick the type of plant you want, pick the temperatures, or even if you're looking for miniatures, and then it'll put out a list. And then if you look at the profiles, you can see their little thing about what temperatures they think it's able to grow at. All right, so I know a little bit over, but I'll end with this. As promised, Kalapana Tropicals, that I've been doing some consulting work for, said that they would be happy to give a 12% discount. I think it's on orders of $50 or more, but double check the website. They just launched a new, easy to remember orchid.farm website. I know some of the folks from there, I believe, are on here. I'll send these slides out to Brad or Kathy or someone so they're available. But yeah, if you like to check them out, they have some really fun stuff. These are the photos from them that I used in this presentation. So I know they at least have these, but many other things as well. With that, I'm going to stop sharing for now, I think. And I would be happy to take questions if we have a little time.
Hi, James. This is Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Hi. Do you know that for the pigeon orchids, the different color ones? Does Hawaii have any of those?
So I don't have a I don't have a photo of it. There's 3 other hybrids, I think, that have been made between it and other species. There's one with Falciparum that has kind of orangish sunset kind of colored flowers. That I think is the most widely, distributed hybrid with it. And I think I've seen it at least once in the state, but I can't remember who was growing it, unfortunately. I know there's 2 or 3 others that have been registered, but I haven't seen them. But yeah, that one, if you can find it, I'm blanking on the name. But as I said, it's Cruminatum, the pigeon orchid with Falciparum, and it's kind of nice orangish, kind of almost sunset pink colors on its flowers. Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you have the pigeon orchid and it's not flowering, it needs a 9-degree temperature drop, normally around wintertime, I believe. I could be wrong about that. And then heavy rain. And the combination of the 9-degree temperature drop and heavy rain seems to be what initiates it into flowering. And as I said, the flowers only last a day, but when it's in flower, it's spectacular.
Yeah, I have the pigeon orchid, and oh man, that when it's really humid, then it will bloom out for us, like here in Hawaii. But different side of the islands, I noticed that everybody's blooms different times. Yeah, it's not all the same time. So, but I do have a lot of it. Like one of them, I got it from my mom's friend's father, and they gave it to me when I was small, and all of a sudden it's like overgrown pot in a 4-inch pot, and it's just tipping over all the time. So I gotta repot it. So
it makes tons of keiki too, and yeah, if you end up with one, you can certainly get friends by passing around keiki of it. And yeah, like you said, certain areas seem to do better. Hilo, I even saw it as a landscaping plant. Not mounted, but people had just put it on the ground, and it covered like several feet of their yard. I may or may not have snuck a keiki from it once or twice, and I wish I'd snuck more because the new owners completely plowed it over. But yeah, it grows really easily though.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And then one more question is the maxillaria. Do we have any other colors besides? We have the what was that, Yamada? The yellow one, the Yamada one here.
I've seen Tenuifolia, which is kind of the reddish one. I've seen Variabilis, which tends to be yellow, I think. I'm trying to remember what I've seen. At least one person who had Shunkiana, that kind of dark reddish, almost black colored one. And I think I saw a Maxillaria striata on Big Island, but I would have to double check my photo log.
Oh, okay, yeah, because I'm interested in those, and like like I have the common one, yeah, the coconut one,
Mm.
and then the Yamato one. But when I saw the other ones, I was like, wow, I wanna get the other colors too, if can get them on hand.
Yeah. And I've seen some hybrids coming out with
Yeah.
them, either with other maxillarias or when I was at the World Orchid Conference, they had a hybrid between Maxillaria and
Uh-huh.
Anguloa, the tulip orchids. They're
Oh.
really weird looking, but
Yeah.
bright neon yellow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, must be expensive.
I didn't even ask the price. I just enjoyed it
Oh.
and took a picture. Yeah. Out of my price range, I knew for sure.
Oh, all right. Sounds good. Hey, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to hear you, Brandon.
Yeah, you too.
I should
Dr.
also
Keach,
say
that was a excellent presentation. I'm just amazed at all the orchids that you've seen and you can remember and talk about each. You must have traveled all around the world to see these orchids.
not as much as I like, but definitely feel very fortunate for the travel I have been able to do. And it's, I feel like for every orchid I see, I hear about two more that are, just waiting out there that I have to track down at some point. But yeah, it's incredible seeing different parts of the world, what people grow and what's common in one place that's rare in somewhere else.
Yeah, I have a lot of these orchids that you mentioned, and I was always wondering why I had a hard time growing some of these, and now I'm finding out they're in the intermediate category, and it might be that my area is just too warm for some of these plants.
Yeah, and it was as I was kind of putting this together, there were even a few that I was like, oh, maybe that's why I had trouble with that one too. Like sometimes it's again finding those microclimates within your yard or making them, just to get that, because there's a few species that are more picky about it than others, but sometimes those can be used to kind of shield one and give it a little bit more shade, a little cooler conditions.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm sure there must be. Questions, anybody? We don't want to let him go.
Oh, James.
Mm.
Sorry, this is Brandon again.
Yeah.
Do you have a email that if I have other questions, but I don't want to hold up the time on here. So
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
I forgot to put it on my slides. I don't
Yeah.
remember that. It's
Yeah.
James Keach at hawaii.edu. The disclaimer I always give is I get a lot of
Yeah.
emails, and so
Yeah.
if you don't hear from
Uh-huh.
me, feel free to send me a
Yeah.
follow-up email in a few days. I will not be offended. It as probably is
Okay.
floated in my mailbox.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
You said James? Oh, sorry.
Hi. So I have a question. The speech that you've given, was it recorded and will it be available to those who want to access this kind of information?
Yes.
It is being recorded, and it will be available to those that registered for this meeting, and also to all of the members and guests of the society.
And I didn't have a chance beforehand, but I'll also make a copy of my slides and can give you a link to that to put in the YouTube thing if that'd be worthwhile too.
Good.
Yes, that would be awesome.
So who was this that was just speaking?
My name is Angelita Cody, but if you wanted to send it to my email, it would be through, it'll be under my maiden name, which is Rasa, RASA, ANJIE at hawaii.edu.
Okay, if you register for this session, you'll get an email with a link to the video.
Okay, that'd be good. Thank you.
Great.
Oh, sorry, James. What was your email again?
Oh, sorry.
James.
It's jkeach at hawaii.edu.
Oh,
I,
James Keach. Okay.
I think if you put james.keach at hawaii.edu, it goes to me as well, but I haven't tried that. So test it out. And if I don't respond at that one, try jkeach at hawaii.edu.
It's in the
Okay.
chat too.
Oh, what was that, Holly?
It's
Sorry.
in the chat also.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's in the chat. Oh, okay. Oh, great. Thanks.
And I'll add it to my slides too when I send the link out for that. I will make a note.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
I have a dumb question. Everybody keeps saying the coconut orchid is
Cool.
easy to grow. It
Hmm.
doesn't like me. I'm a number 2. I tried it inside. I tried it outside. I'm going to try again. Is there anything I should know or not? I'm
Where on the island are you living, if you don't mind me
kind of
asking?
high up and it's kind of cool, but it's hot in my side. So I thought if I try inside, maybe it'll be happier. No. So I don't know if
Hmm.
I'm not watering enough or watering it too much. I think not enough, maybe.
How often were you watering it?
Because it's cooler up here, maybe every 4 to 7 days. It just depended.
That sounds about right. Is the humidity relatively high where you are? Or is it kind of low?
Well, inside I think it's not as high. Outside I think it's higher.
So one thing I had to adjust to when I was living on the mainland is keeping the humidity high, and that might be one of the reasons it does well in a lot of places outside here. One thing we used to do if we didn't want mosquitoes, but we did want to kind of increase the ambient humidity, is we'd do a kind of tray with gravel in it and then add water to that. And so that way it holds the pot above the water. It doesn't create a space that mosquitoes can breed in, but it sort of creates a little bit of ambient humidity around it.
Oh, great. I'm going to try that. Thank you.
Sure. And I would also say, you know, if you have higher light areas, it can take relatively high light too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Hi, this is Sandy. I have a question about the twinkle doros. I think you had a picture of kind of a lavender white one. I have a yellow one that's spiked now since October, but no flowers are coming out. It's just the spikes are coming out.
Sorry, which one was it again?
The twinkle doro.
Was
Like
that
the
was that a
little
dendrobium or?
No,
Yeah.
it's kind of, I think it's an oncidium.
Oh, okay. I think I'm gonna do a share screen real quick and let me know if it's the right one. But are you looking at this one or are you?
Yeah, the little one. That
This one? Yeah, yeah. Sorry. What was your question about it again? I got distracted.
I have a yellow twinkle doro, but the spikes started coming out in October and they're still coming out, but there's no flowers.
What? I've seen, they take a while for me sometimes, but I haven't heard of them taking that long. What is it potted in, if you don't mind me asking?
I really haven't I haven't taken the pot apart. The surface has that green moss.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure this is what's going on. I know for whatever reason, a lot of folks commercially sell oncidiums in that moss, and it can be all right, especially when they're smaller, but it really holds on to liquid and can kind of rot them out if it's going on. And I know sometimes with flowering, the plant will, sorry, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can don't look at you or look at the screen straight on. But sometimes if the plant is stressed, it'll try to flower. And I've seen two kind of outcomes. Sometimes it'll force itself to flower and then die, which I think you would know by now. It would be definitely showing it like all sorts of bad signs. Or it'll start to flower and then kind of take a while to develop with that. Are you fertilizing it at all? Or?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I fertilize once a month with Miller's and with EM.
When was the last time you repotted it?
Actually, I haven't. I've had it for about 3 years, but if I repot it, okay, most of my oncidiums, if I repot it, they don't seem to do too good. So I've left this one alone.
Mhm.
But like I said, it started spiking in October. The spikes are very, very healthy, but there's no flowers coming out of it.
Yeah, you know, I'm not 100% sure of, what the best advice is for you. My inclination, anytime a plant is kind of slowing down, is to look at their root health. And if it hasn't been repotted in a while, I normally shoot for every 2 years with a plant. I mean, that being said, not to make myself a hypocrite, but I have plenty of plants that, kind of definitely fall behind those 2 years. Or otherwise, sometimes even just kind of pulling out some of the media and letting it just not be as wet for a bit. I've had ones where like they were super, super wet. They were in moss that had started to break down, and they almost need a little bit of a dry period to kind of let the roots recover sometimes. Because if it's too wet, even it's kind of that old saying about salt water, right? Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. If it's too wet, the roots start kind of rotting sometimes, so they can't uptake the water. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I see in the chat that, yeah, Holly is saying that bark only and no media that are happy. Yeah, again, in one of those embarrassing things, I have Siku Marguerite, which is one of the offspring of Twinkle. And I had a plant that I pulled the pot off of and then forgot of, and it kind of latched itself onto cinder block and then started flowering and seemed really happy, much better than the ones I had in pots. So sometimes I think we tend to baby orchids a little bit, and sometimes it's good to kind of, I guess, almost like kids, give them a little space to do their own thing and neglect them a little bit. Oh, and sorry, I see in the chat also a question about sulfur in the air affecting health. Definitely an issue on Big Island I've seen before, where it can lead to acid rain sometimes. Tends to be more of an issue for the thinner leafed orchids, things like oncidiums, not as much for kind of thicker leafed ones. I haven't heard too much about places outside Big Island getting enough of it to cause it problems. But if you are seeing lots of fog, I mean, like here, it looked like there was a forest fire just yesterday and the day before with all the fog. Might be worth kind of rinsing the plants off a little bit to kind of dilute some of that sulfuric acid, or covering them and watering with your own water.
James, if you don't mind saying, what kind of work are you doing at Kalapana Tropicals?
Yeah, so I don't think the owners are on here. Otherwise, I know one of the folks is. So Kalapana was started, I believe, back in the 80s by a couple who are still in the state, but had been looking to sell it. And they sold it to an amazing couple who had been working in, I think it was Texas and California beforehand. Didn't have as much orchid background, but were kind of really passionate outdoors people. And so really good at running a business, good gardeners, but we're kind of, orchids are so weird in a lot of ways compared to some other plants. And so there were some things that they were asking about, kind of trying to shift from a plant focus over to that. So it's been, kind of like orchid culture stuff, things like judging, orchid judging is not an intuitive process. Sometimes it has its own weird little subculture. So it's been helping them navigate things like that, doing some background stuff on some of the rarer species they have to give them info, producing videos and some pictures and things like that. But yeah, mostly trying to kind of connect them with the larger orchid community. And it's, a side thing for the most part, but it's a lot of fun, as much as anything else for me.
I had a question.
Sure.
You were suggesting putting the orchid up high. Can we any style orchid, or is it specific orchids that can go up high? Because I'm in an apartment, I just have a balcony.
I would say some orchids that like it slightly warmer and that can take more light, I would go for high. So things like vandas would do really well, some cattleyas, some dendrobiums. I wouldn't put like a phalaenopsis up there, probably be a little too, especially if it's full sun there. But some of the higher light orchids would be good and might even like the little increase in temperature. The one thing I will say with if you are putting them up high, besides the temperature increase, sometimes you'll see more airflow up there just because there's less stuff blocking it. And so just keep an eye on, if it needs a little more water than the others. Sometimes that works out well. If you have an orchid that likes it a little bit drier, you can kind of keep it up there and, and even shade it if you need to, but kind of get the best of both worlds. But the example I think of a lot, and unfortunately I haven't seen a really good reference book about him, is there was a grower, I'm blanking on his first name, Moyer in Manoa Valley, who did an amazing amount of breeding with cattleyas and oncidiums. And he described in one of his books about breeding them that his yard in Manoa Valley, he just kept walking around and finding where little air eddies would go, where he would get more precipitation, what areas were kind of in a rain shadow. And he was able to grow just an absolutely amazing range of species by kind of slowly getting a sense of his yard. Unfortunately, he passed away, and my understanding is most of his plants kind of disappeared with him. But he had some really neat things, and there are several of his hybrids that I know are still circulating around the islands. So if he can do it in Manoa Valley, I know he can do the same thing, in an apartment on the Lanai. Good ale. Sorry, I saw Jan put it in the chat. Thank you, Jan. Always on top of things. Good ale, Moyer.
Wake up, Eddie.
Okay, nobody else? I hate to let Dr. Keach get away without any more questions.
I'll put my email in the slides. I'll get it out. But again, don't be afraid to remind me 2 or 3 times if you need to get in touch. And I miss it. I'm notorious for that, unfortunately. I keep trying to change. But yeah, I'm always happy to try to answer questions. And then I don't make it over to Oahu as much, but I'll be at the Hilo Orchid Show in another 6 months or so. And definitely happy to talk story there, if nothing else.
How often do you come to Oahu?
Not as often as I'd like. I
Okay.
go to Hilo more for the Kalapana thing. I get to Oahu maybe every 3 or 4 months, probably. Transit there mostly, unfortunately.
Great. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much, Dr. Keach. That was a very fantastic presentation. I really like your photos. There was quite a variety of orchids that you showed.
Thanks. It was really fun to put together. And again, many thanks for the invitation.
So, Kathy, you have any last words?
No, I really enjoyed his talk. It was very informative. And James, we're hoping to see you at our HOS 2023 show in October.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
Okay, so we'll send you a formal invite, but you're one of our special people. Thank you.
I really enjoyed being at the last show. It was so much fun, and you all had incredible displays. So yeah, be there in October for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, James Keach was at the last Horned Orchid Society show in October, and he manned one of the tables there, and that table was always busy. Everybody wanted to talk to you.
I was lucky in that my coworker, Hannah Luchin, who's same position but on Maui, was there as well. And she's brilliant. Doesn't have the orchid background, but boy, she knows her pests and diseases well. So yeah, really lucky to work with a good team.